back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I am going to wrap up the books that I read in the month of June. June was a really busy month, full of lots of traveling the second half of the month. So I got some reading done, some audiobooking done, but my regular schedules were kind of upended. So I have 7 books that I finished during the month of June, but I had 1 DNF and then several that I'm in the progress of. So one of those is actually The Well of Ascension, which I should have finished by the end of June, but our live show is not until the first Saturday in July, which gives me like a week into July and I'm like halfway at the end of June. So I can totally finish that because it's a super fast read. The other book that I've been working on has been ongoing throughout the summer, and that is The Tale of Genji. And I'm about halfway through this one as well, which feels like such an accomplishment. I will be continuing on this through I think the second week in August. So I won't have this wrapped up in July either. And then the 1 DNF that I had was an audiobook that we were listening to on our trip that my husband really wanted to listen to. It was a David McCullough book, and we had finished one David McCullough book, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But this one, I can't even remember what it's called. It'll be on the screen here. It's about Americans who were journeying to Paris and the various things that they learned there, things that they brought back to the States, because there was a lot of training in France that the United States didn't have in terms of art and science and all of those kinds of things. So there were parts of it that were really interesting, particularly with people whose name I recognized, like Samuel Morse plays a big part in it, as does James Fenimore Cooper and some other people. But there was a lot of people who had no idea who they were and were bouncing from person to person to subject to then what Paris was like as a whole. And so it felt kind of disjointed to me, and I wasn't all that invested in it. So we got about halfway through in our trip, and I had no plans to continue once we got back because it just wasn't gripping me as much as I had hoped. Okay, so the rest of these books I did finish, and I just decided I'm going to do a ranking thing, which was kind of easy because I only had 1 5-star book this month. So we're going to start at the bottom and work our way to the top. The lowest ranked book that I finished this month, I did a whole spoilery vlog on, so you can check that out if you want my in-depth thoughts, but that is Shark Heart by Emily Hayback. This is a book that is getting passed around my in-person book club, and we're all reading it and taking notes in it. So far, one of us has liked it, one of us has hated it, and one has really mixed feelings, and they're in the middle of reading it right now. So I'm really excited to see what the general consensus on this book ends up being. This is a literary fiction work about a couple who gets married, and very shortly after they get married, the man gets a diagnosis that he is turning into a great white shark. And this is in a world where these animal dementia diseases, as they call them, are actually relatively common. So I think it's exploring a lot about grief and a lot about terminal illnesses and dealing with that kind of stuff, but it is just so over the top ridiculous in its descriptions and some of the phrasing, where I feel like the author was trying to sound super literary and trying to tell us how deep this book is, but I didn't actually get a sense of any depth. I just felt her telling me how deep it was. I think this book would have worked far better if it had been a sci-fi or a horror, because she still could have explored those same themes, but then leaned harder into the animal mutation thing, and it would have been more effective, I think. Also, to update you on my summer book bingo progress, Shark Heart has been added onto the Buzzy book space. Moving on to 3-star books, we have Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers. This is a cozy mystery, and as such, it went on my cozy mystery space for my bingo board. This is the story of an elderly Chinese lady who runs a tea shop that she actually calls Vera Wang's world famous tea house. And she purposely left it Vera Wang because Vera Wang is famous, and so she thought maybe more people would come to her tea shop. She is meddling and so blunt, and is just a delight of a character. I loved her so much. She was by far the highlight of this book. one day she wakes up and goes downstairs into her tea shop and realizes that there is a dead man lying on the floor. And so she contacts the police, but she thinks the police are totally inept because they think this is an accident, and she is convinced that it absolutely is not an accident, and she decides she can do a better job than the police investigating this. So she gathers a crew around her of people who she thinks are suspects. But over time, they come to become friends and develop relationships with one another. So it's kind of got like a cozy found family feel to it as well. I thought that the mystery itself was fine, I guess. I didn't love the ending of it. I just kind of thought it was not the greatest, and I wasn't really invested in any of the side characters and their relationships and their emotional struggles that Vera is helping them with. I never felt connected to them, and I just kind of didn't care. The thing that really made this book so fun was Vera, and there's a good chunks of the book where we're not with Vera, we're switching viewpoints and we're with different people at different times, and I wish I could have just stayed with Vera the whole time because she was the best part. The next book I would say is more of a 3.5, and that is Attack on Titan Volume 12. I read this when I was feeling kind of slumpy, so part of that may be me rather than the volume itself, but I feel like the last couple of volumes that I've read feels like we're not really getting a whole lot. We're not really getting any answers, and it's just kind of, I feel like in a little bit of limbo, I guess. And we had some really amazing episodes like 8, 9, and 10. Those volumes were like, I loved all of those. Those were like 5-star volumes, some of my favorites. But the last couple have just kind of felt like kind of a little bit of a lull where there's not really too much new happening, but we're also not getting answers for any of the questions. And so like, I'm still enjoying it, but I think that this is just kind of what happens when you have a manga series that's over 30 volumes. You're gonna have some that are kind of like more character development or more filler, and you're not getting the same like breakneck pace that you have in some of the other volumes. So it kind of makes sense, because if you're reading a super long book, there would be moments where it's quiet and moments where there's a lot happening. And so I think that that's what's happening here. Moving on to 4-star reads, we have Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. This was my classics read for the month of June, in addition to being the book that was chosen as a Patreon recommendation for me to vlog, because I had several patrons that had wanted me to read this book and thought that I would really enjoy it. And I did. I kind of have some mixed feelings about it. So this is a story about Chichikov, who is a Russian man who is coming into this city and kind of like whining and dining the rich people of the town and trying to just kind of like get in with them. And we find out very shortly that his reasoning for doing this is that he wants to find rich landowners who have serfs who have died. At this point, Russia was taking a census, and when they would take a census, then you would report how many serfs you had at the time and then have to pay taxes on them until the next census. So there were people who they had serfs who had died, and they're still paying taxes on them because there hadn't been another census. So he's trying to kind of make it like he's doing them a favor by taking these serfs off their hands. But in all actuality, he has a scheme and he has a plan here of what he wants to accomplish with this, and we're not really sure what that is. So the writing in this is vivid and beautiful and amazing, but it also kind of ended up being a bit of a bummer, because Gogol intended for this to be 3 volumes, and he had published volume 1 and was working on volume 2, and twice in his lifetime he burned the manuscript for volume 2, and so it was never published, and he never wrote volume 3. So what we have here is we have volume 1, which is expertly written, is so funny, the descriptions are so wonderful, and then we have bits of volume 2 in this edition where it's like, here's the first like 3 or 4 chapters or something like that, and then a later chapter. But a whole bunch of the chapters have sections that are missing or words that are not able to be read. And then there's also like the actual like last chapter that they have in here ends in the middle of a sentence because they just included the bits that they have. So even if we had volume 2 completed here, which we don't, we still don't know what happens to Chichikov and how things end for him. So that kind of feels like a bit of a bummer. Like volume 2 felt so disjointed, which is what happens when you only have bits of a manuscript that was burned and the author didn't ever approve of it being published. Within that, there was still really good writing, but because we have all these jumps and pages that are missing of the manuscript, even within a same chapter, you're missing plot points. So it's like, okay, now all of a sudden we're with these other people and there's this con that Chichikov is doing, and you're kind of like, wait, what is he doing? Because you didn't get any of that leading up to it. So it felt like kind of a letdown. I could see this having been a 5-star if it had been completed, but unfortunately it was not. But the writing's so good. Time to talk about the other David McCullough that I've already mentioned, and that's Mornings on Horseback. This is a biography of Teddy Roosevelt and his early life. And the thing about this that kept it from being a 5-star for me, I think, was that I really wanted this to be a biography of all of Teddy Roosevelt's life, and I was under the impression that it was. And it's not. So we get a lot of his childhood. Like, I think the first half of the book is just his childhood and part of his like high school and college years, and then the rest of it is like his first marriage and his foraying into kind of different public causes and his beginnings into politics. But like, we miss the whole thing with like the Rough Riders, we miss all of his presidential stuff, we miss basically his entire relationship with his second wife and the 4 or 5 children that he has with her. So there's a lot of things that we don't get, and so it felt a little bit unsatisfying for me because there was like kind of like a very roundabout quick little thing at the end in the epilogue. So I wish that this had been his whole life because I was enjoying it so much. This is the first David McCullough that I've finished so far. He's one of my husband's favorite authors, and my husband has read probably 4 or 5 of his. So I definitely want to read more from him, but I picked this up because my daughter, one of the last books that she read for school this year was a biography of Teddy Roosevelt. It was really funny because hers was the complete opposite. She said she got about a third of the way through the book and then he died, and the rest of it was kind of talking about his values and his lasting impact. And she still absolutely loved it, but she talked about so much that I wanted to learn more about Teddy Roosevelt. So we had opposite problems where hers was more the end of his life and mine was more the beginning. This went on my nonfiction space for my bingo board, by the way, and then Dead Souls went on a book you've been putting off because I've owned this book for like 3 years and been meaning to pick it up. I just hadn't. The last 4-star book that I have here is actually one that I started in May but finished in June, and so it doesn't count for my bingo board because for summer book bingo has to be a book that you started in June and finished by the end of August. So unfortunately, this does not count. It would have been perfect for a joyful space or a nature space, but that's Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. This was actually the group read for my Patreon in May, and as you can tell by all the tabs, I loved this book. I read Something Wicked This Way Comes last fall and it made it into like my top books of the year, even though it was a 4-star book. And this is also a 4-star book because it's just not quite perfect for me. There are times where Bradbury's prose just doesn't quite work for me. There were chapters in this that I felt a little bit out of place for me, but overall I absolutely loved it. So this is the story of a young boy named Douglas and his brother, and it takes place during the summer of 1928. So it's super nostalgic feeling, and it's just like super episodic of the things that they get up to during the summer and the other people in this small town in Illinois. And essentially it's a story about growing up, and it's so beautiful. It's so well written. It's so deep. I'm still thinking about it. I really loved it. So it's pretty close to a 5-star, but it just didn't quite make it there for me. And the last book that I wanted to talk about this month was the only 5-star book that I finished during the month of June, and that is Fidelity by Wendell Berry. So this is the first time I have read Wendell Berry, and this is a collection of 5 of his short stories. They take place in the same town that all of his fictional works do, I think, like, you know, Hannah Coulter, Nathan Coulter, Jayber Crow, like all of those books, they take place in, I think it's called Port William. And so all of these short stories take place there and actually include quite a few of the same characters because Hannah and Nathan Coulter are actually in some of these short stories. So there's a lot of crossover, a lot of the same characters, but I don't think, I assume, because I loved it and didn't feel lost, I don't think you have to have read the other books to get the context that you need for these short stories. I just thought they were really beautifully written. I thought that it was such a perfect picture of Kentucky, and I read this with my in-person book club, and we all agreed because many of us had wanted to read Wendell Berry for a while and hadn't yet because he is a Kentucky author. And I feel like he encapsulates Kentucky so well, even though these stories take place a long time in the past. I feel like it really encapsulates what life in Kentucky feels like. Kind of that slow country living, the way that people interact with each other in a small town, and it's just perfect. Like, it's so good. And some of the stories deal with grief and loss in a really beautiful and meaningful way. And I loved every second of reading this book. Like, it was just so perfect. And even though this was my first Wendell Berry, it certainly will not be my last. So I'm actually going to put Fidelity in the nature spot on my board because I feel like there was just so many gorgeous descriptions of the countryside in Kentucky. So as you can see from my bingo board, I am nowhere close to a bingo because I don't plan out my reads very well, at least at the beginning of the summer. I just kind of plug in when I'm already reading and then see where I need to fill in. So there's lots of spaces that I need to fill in, but we'll get there. Well, those are the books that I read during the month of June. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. What have you been reading? What was your favorite book that you read in the month of June? And if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here, I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.